Sometimes the worst thing that ever happened to you becomes the reason you're alive when someone else needs saving. Sometimes a man who's lost everything is exactly who God sends when children have nothing left. Jeremiah Wolfe lives alone in the mountains, far from people and memories that hurt too much. He's 67 and ready to die in peace. Then, one winter night, a little girl knocks on his door. She's 4 years old, sick, and carrying her baby sister, who's burning with fever. Their parents are dead, and she's walked through the snow for days. "Please, mister," she whispers, "be our papa before we die." Will this broken old man find the strength to save 2 little lives? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence of winter mornings in the high Colorado Rockies had become Jeremiah Wolfe's closest companion over the past 15 years. At dawn, he would step onto the weathered planks of his front porch, Winchester rifle cradled in the crook of his arm, and listen to the absolute quiet that only 10,000 feet of elevation could provide. No voices calling his name, no laughter echoing from the kitchen, no small feet pattering across wooden floors. Just the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the distant cry of a hawk riding the thermals. His cabin sat like a forgotten prayer in a clearing carved from towering evergreens, 3 miles up a winding trail that most folks had stopped traveling years ago. The structure itself told the story of a man who had once cared deeply about permanence. Hand-hewn logs fitted with the precision of a master craftsman. A stone chimney that drew smoke cleanly even in the worst weather. Windows that still held their glass despite countless storms. But time had weathered the stain to silver gray, and the porch sagged slightly where the foundation had settled. Inside, the cabin held the austere efficiency of a man who lived for function alone. A single room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting space, with a narrow staircase leading to a loft where he slept. The furniture was solid and practical. A oak table for one, a chair worn smooth by years of use, shelves holding only what he needed to survive. No photographs adorned the walls. No mementos gathered dust on the windowsills. Jeremiah had learned that memories lived better in the darkness of closed boxes than in the daily light, where they could ambush a man's peace. The Winchester hung above the mantelpiece, its walnut stock polished smooth by decades of handling. That rifle had fed him through 15 winters and kept the occasional desperate man or predator at respectful distance. It was the one possession he maintained with religious care, cleaning and oiling it each week, whether he'd fired it or not. A man alone in the mountains needed to trust his tools completely. Each morning followed the same ritual. Coffee brewed strong enough to strip paint, bacon and eggs if his snares had been productive, cornmeal mush if they hadn't. Then he would check his trap lines, hunt if meat was running low, or spend hours splitting wood for the endless hunger of the stone fireplace. Physical labor kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering down paths that led nowhere good. The townsfolk in Cedar Ridge, 20 miles down the mountain, had long since stopped expecting to see Jeremiah Wolfe at their social gatherings or church services. He made the trip to trade for supplies maybe 4 times a year: coffee, flour, ammunition, and the few manufactured goods his isolation required. He spoke only when spoken to, conducted his business with quiet efficiency, and disappeared back up the mountain before anyone could engage him in conversation about weather or politics or any of the small talk that bound communities together. Most folks remembered when he'd been different, before the fire. Before the grief had hollowed him out like a beetle-killed pine. Jeremiah Wolfe had once been the kind of man who helped neighbors with barn raisings and stayed late at harvest celebrations. His wife, Martha, had been the heart of every church social, bringing her famous apple pies and making sure the shy children felt included in games. Their son David had been 8 years old, bright as a new penny, always trailing after his father with questions about everything from why snow was white to how birds knew which direction was south. The fire had taken them both on a November night 15 years past, while Jeremiah was 3 days into the mountains tracking a wounded elk. He'd come home to find nothing but charred timber and ash, the volunteer fire brigade still throwing buckets of water on the smouldering remains. A chimney stone had cracked, they said. Sparks had caught in the roof. Martha and David had died from smoke in their sleep, which the townspeople assured him was a mercy. Mercy. Jeremiah had stopped believing in mercy that day. He'd built his mountain cabin with his own hands that winter, working through blizzards and sub-zero temperatures with the focused intensity of a man who needed physical exhaustion to quiet the voices in his head. By spring, he was settled into his new life as Cedar Ridge's resident hermit, the grieving widower who chose an exile over the well-meaning sympathy of friends and neighbors. Now, at 67, his hair had gone completely white, and his beard reached nearly to his chest. Deep lines mapped the weathered landscape of his face, carved by wind and sun and the weight of carrying sorrow alone. His hands remained steady and strong from years of splitting wood and working trap lines, but his shoulders had developed the slight stoop of a man who no longer had reason to stand tall, the knock that shattered. His evening solitude came so softly at first that he thought it might be a branch scraping against the door. But then it came again, weak but definitely human, and Jeremiah felt something cold settle in his stomach. Nobody climbed his mountain after dark. Nobody climbed his mountain at all anymore, unless they were lost or desperate or bringing bad news. He approached the door with the Winchester in his hands, though he kept it low and non-threatening. Through the thick wooden planks, he could hear something that made his chest tighten, the sound of a child crying. Thin and exhausted, when he pulled the door open, the sight that greeted him challenged everything he thought he knew about human endurance. A little girl stood in his doorway, swaying on her feet like a sapling in a strong wind. She couldn't have been more than 4 years old, her dark hair matted with snow and dirt, her clothes, what remained of them, hanging in tatters. Her feet were wrapped in strips of cloth that had once been a woman's dress, and the makeshift shoes were stained with blood from walking on frozen ground. But it was what she held in her thin arms that stopped Jeremiah's breathing entirely. A baby, maybe 18 months old, lay motionless against the girl's chest. The infant's face was flushed with fever, her tiny lips cracked and pale. The child's breathing came in quick, shallow gasps that spoke of illness and exhaustion. "Please, mister," the little girl whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Be our papa before we die." The words hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. He'd spent 15 years building walls around his heart, constructing barriers that would keep him safe from exactly this kind of moment, the moment when someone needed him more than he needed his carefully maintained solitude. For a long moment, he stood frozen in the doorway, the warmth from his cabin spilling out around him while 2 children waited in the snow to learn whether they would live or die based on his decision. The practical part of his mind catalogued their condition with the efficiency of a man who'd seen death before. Severe dehydration, malnutrition. The baby was burning with fever and might not survive the night, even with care. Taking them in could mean watching children die under his roof, and he wasn't sure his heart could survive that kind of breaking twice in one lifetime. But the little girl looked up at him with eyes that held no expectation of mercy. Only the desperate hope of someone who had already accepted that hope was probably foolish. And in that look, Jeremiah saw something he recognized, the expression of someone who had lost everything but was still fighting to save what remained. "Come inside," he heard himself say, stepping back to make room. "Quickly now, before you catch your death." The girl stumbled across the threshold, her legs barely able to carry her own weight, much less her sister's. Jeremiah caught them both as they began to fall, surprised by how little they weighed, like bird bones wrapped in cloth. The baby's fever burned against his chest as he lifted them, and he could feel the rapid flutter of her heartbeat against his ribs. As he carried them toward the fire, Jeremiah caught sight of his reflection in the dark window glass, a white-haired hermit holding 2 dying children against the warm light of his lonely cabin. For the first time in 15 years, his home didn't look like a tomb. It looked like a place where miracles might be possible, if a man could remember how to believe in them. The baby's fever was worse than Jeremiah had initially realized. As he laid both children on the worn quilt beside his fireplace, the infant's breathing came in rapid, shallow pants that spoke of a body fighting a losing battle. Her skin burned with heat that seemed to radiate from her tiny frame, and when Jeremiah touched her forehead with the back of his weathered hand, he knew they had maybe hours, not days. "What's your name, child?" he asked the older girl, who hadn't let go of her sister even after they'd reached the warmth of the cabin. "Katie," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying and cold. "This is Anna. She's been sick since—" The words caught in her throat like broken glass. Jeremiah's medical knowledge was limited to the practical skills a mountain man acquired over decades of solitude. Setting bones, treating cuts, dealing with his own injuries when help was 20 miles away down a dangerous trail. But he'd never faced anything like this. 2 children balanced on the edge of death, dependent entirely on his ability to keep them breathing through the night. He moved with the efficiency of a man accustomed to crisis, though his hands trembled slightly as he built up the fire to chase away the bone-deep cold that had settled into their small bodies. From his meager supplies he gathered what he could: clean rags, his bottle of whiskey, a tin cup for water, and the few herbs Martha had taught him to recognize years ago for treating fever. "Katie, I need you to listen to me," he said, kneeling beside them and keeping his voice steady despite the urgency clawing at his chest. "Can you tell me what happened to your parents?" The little girl's eyes, which had been focused entirely on her sister, slowly lifted to meet his. They were brown eyes, intelligent and far too old for a 4-year-old face. "The sickness came to our house. Mama and Papa got the burning fever, then the shaking, then they wouldn't wake up anymore." Cholera, Jeremiah realized with a cold certainty. The disease had swept through mining camps and settlements all across the territory that summer, leaving families destroyed and communities decimated. If these children had been exposed, they might be carrying it themselves. "How long ago?" he asked. 4 sleeps, Katie said, then amended with the precision of a child who had been counting survival in small increments. "Maybe 5. Anna got sick the day after we left. I carried her, but she's so heavy and I got tired. 4 days. These children had been walking through mountain wilderness for 4 days, the older one carrying the younger through snow and freezing temperatures with no food and no shelter. The fact that they were still alive spoke to a kind of determination that humbled Jeremiah to his core. Anna's fever spiked suddenly, her tiny body convulsing with chills despite the warmth radiating from the fireplace. Jeremiah had seen enough death to recognize the signs. They were losing her. "Hold her steady," he told Katie, then poured a small amount of whiskey into the tin cup and diluted it with water from his kettle. The alcohol might help bring down the fever, though he knew it was a desperate measure for such a small child. Using a clean rag, he began cooling Anna's burning forehead and wrists, the places where fever concentrated. The whiskey solution he administered 1 drop at a time, massaging her throat to encourage swallowing. Katie watched his every movement with the intensity of someone learning skills she might need to save her sister again. "Tell me about your mama and papa," Jeremiah said softly, partly to keep Katie calm and partly to learn more about what they were facing. "What were their names?" "Mama was Emily, Papa was Frank Mitchell. We lived in a little house near the creek, down in the valley where the gold mines are." Katie's voice grew stronger as she talked, as if speaking about her parents gave her some of their strength. "Mama made the best biscuits, and Papa would sing songs after supper. He had a nice voice. Emily Mitchell." The name stirred something in Jeremiah's memory, but he pushed the recognition aside to focus on the immediate crisis. Anna's breathing had slowed slightly, though whether from the fever breaking or her condition worsening, he couldn't tell. Through the long night, Jeremiah fought for Anna's life with the stubborn determination of a man who had already lost too much to death. He cooled her fever with wet rags, forced small amounts of water past her cracked lips, and monitored her breathing with the vigilance of a sentry on guard duty. Katie helped as much as her exhausted body allowed, holding her sister when the chills came and singing soft lullabies in a voice that broke with weariness. As dawn approached, something shifted. Anna's fever broke in a rush of sweat that soaked through the makeshift bedding, and her breathing deepened into something that sounded less like drowning and more like sleep. The crisis had passed, though Jeremiah knew they weren't out of danger yet. "Is she going to be okay?" Katie asked, her small hand resting on her sister's chest to feel the steady rise and fall of breathing. "I think so," Jeremiah said, though he kept his voice cautious. "The fever's broken, which is good, but she'll need food and rest and time to get strong again." Katie nodded, with the seriousness of someone who understood that survival was never guaranteed, only earned one day at a time. "Thank you, mister. I prayed to God to send us someone good, and he sent us you." The simple faith in her words hit Jeremiah like a punch to the chest. It had been 15 years since he'd believed God sent anyone anything good. 15 years since he'd thought prayer was anything more than words thrown into an empty sky. But looking at these two children, alive against all odds, breathing peacefully by his fire, he felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought had died with Martha and David. Maybe God hadn't abandoned him after all. Maybe God had just been waiting for the right moment to remind him that some things were worth saving, even when saving them meant risking your heart all over again. The blizzard outside howled with renewed fury, piling snow against the windows and making the cabin creak with wind pressure. But inside, warmed by fire and the presence of life he'd thought he'd never welcome again, Jeremiah Wolfe began to remember what it felt like to be needed by someone other than himself. He settled into his chair to keep watch through the remaining hours of darkness, the Winchester within easy reach, but no longer the most important thing in his world. Two little girls slept by his fire, breathing steadily, their faces peaceful for the first time since they'd knocked on his door. And for the first time in 15 years, Jeremiah didn't mind the idea of morning coming. 3 days had passed since the night Jeremiah thought he might lose Anna to the fever, and the change in his cabin felt as dramatic as the shift from winter to spring. Where once there had been only the measured sounds of one man's routine, the scrape of his chair across the floor, the clink of a single cup against the table, the solitary rhythm of his footsteps, now there was something else entirely. Life, messy, unpredictable, wonderfully chaotic life. Anna had recovered with the resilience that seemed to be the exclusive province of children, progressing from barely conscious to sitting up to taking her first tentative steps around the cabin in the span of 48 hours. She was a beautiful child, with hair the color of summer wheat, and eyes that reminded Jeremiah painfully of Martha's, the same deep blue that seemed to hold secrets and kindness in equal measure. Katie, meanwhile, had appointed herself as both nurse and household manager, with the seriousness of someone far older than her 4 years. She helped feed Anna with a patience that amazed Jeremiah, making sure her little sister got the best portions of their simple meals and fashioning toys, from pine cones and scraps of cloth to keep her entertained. But it was while searching for additional blankets in the storage chest beneath his bed that Jeremiah discovered something that stopped him cold. Buried beneath winter woolens and spare ammunition, his fingers closed around a familiar shape, smooth wood, worn soft by small hands. David's toy horse. He lifted it slowly as if it might crumble at his touch. The carving was simple but skillfully done, something he'd whittled during long winter evenings when David was still learning to walk. His son had carried that horse everywhere, making galloping sounds and spinning elaborate stories about cowboys and adventures that always ended with the hero coming home safely. Martha had packed it away after the funeral, along with David's other belongings, and Jeremiah had never had the courage to look at them again. But now, holding the toy in his weathered hands, he felt something different from the crushing grief that had defined the last 15 years. The pain was still there, sharp and immediate, but alongside it was something else, a recognition that love didn't have to die with the person you'd lost. "What's that?" Katie asked, appearing at his elbow with the silent efficiency she'd developed for moving around the cabin. Jeremiah's first instinct was to hide the toy, to protect his privacy and his pain. But something in Katie's open, curious expression made him reconsider. "This belonged to my little boy," he said quietly. "He was about your size when he died." Katie studied the horse with the serious attention she gave to everything important. "What was his name?" "David." The name came easier than it had in years. "David's a good name," she said with the authority of someone who had given the matter careful consideration. "Can Anna play with David's horse? She likes horses." "She makes the noise." To demonstrate, Katie made a soft nickering sound that was surprisingly accurate. The request should have hurt. Should have felt like sacrilege or betrayal or any of the dozen emotions that had kept Jeremiah locked away from the world for so long. Instead, it felt like permission to let his son's memory live in something other than grief. "I think David would like that," Jeremiah said, holding out the toy horse. He always did enjoy sharing. Anna received the gift with the reverence children reserved for truly special treasures, clutching it against her chest and immediately beginning the galloping sounds Katie had promised. Watching her play, Jeremiah felt a strange lightness in his chest, as if some weight he'd been carrying had quietly shifted. The days began to develop their own rhythm, different from the solitary routine that had governed Jeremiah's life for 15 years. Mornings started with the challenge of preparing breakfast for 3 instead of 1, a task that required creativity given his limited cooking skills and even more limited supplies. He'd managed bacon and eggs for himself well enough, but children needed variety, nutrients, and portions sized for small stomachs. Katie proved to be an invaluable assistant in the kitchen, standing on a wooden crate to reach the counter and demonstrating a surprising knowledge of cooking basics. "Mama taught me to stir without splashing," she explained seriously as she helped him prepare a pot of oatmeal. "And you have to taste everything to make sure it's not too salty." Anna's contribution to meal preparation was less practical but infinitely more entertaining. She had developed a fascination with the coffee grinder, turning the handle with intense concentration while making sound effects that bore no resemblance to actual grinding. The coffee that resulted from her assistance was unpredictably coarse, but Jeremiah found he didn't mind the variation. Afternoons brought the discovery that children required constant supervision and entertainment in ways that Jeremiah had forgotten since David's death. Anna, in particular, seemed drawn to every potentially dangerous object in the cabin with the unerring instinct of someone who had never learned proper fear. She investigated the fireplace with scientific curiosity, attempted to befriend the steel trap hanging on the wall, and showed concerning interest in the bullets lined up on the mantelpiece. "She's like a little explorer," Katie explained when Jeremiah expressed amazement at her sister's fearlessness. "Mama used to say Anna could find trouble in an empty room." The comment struck Jeremiah with unexpected force. These children had mothers who had loved them, who had watched them grow and worried about their futures and created the kind of memories that survived even after death. They weren't just orphans who needed shelter. They were complete human beings with histories and personalities and ways of moving through the world that had been shaped by love and loss in equal measure. Evening became the most challenging and the most rewarding time of day. Children, Jeremiah discovered, required elaborate bedtime rituals that seemed designed to delay the actual moment of sleep for as long as possible. There were requests for water, negotiations about blanket arrangements, and an apparently endless need for stories. "Tell us about the bear," Katie would request, settling Anna against her side on the makeshift bed they'd created near the fireplace. "What bear?" Jeremiah would ask, though by now he knew the routine. "The one that came to your cabin last summer. The really big one, with the fur that looked like chocolate." So Jeremiah would tell them about the black bear who had spent 3 days investigating his garbage pit, embellishing the story slightly more each night, until the bear had become a legendary creature of enormous size and surprising intelligence. Anna would listen with wide eyes, clutching David's toy horse. while Katie provided helpful commentary about proper bear-avoiding techniques. These moments, with firelight dancing across their faces and their breathing gradually deepening into sleep, felt like something Jeremiah had forgotten was possible, peace that came not from isolation, but from connection. As he watched over their dreams, he began to understand that healing didn't always mean returning to who you used to be. Sometimes it meant becoming someone entirely new. The morning Jeremiah realized the children needed proper clothes marked a turning point in his understanding of what it meant to care for someone other than himself. Katie's dress, what remained of it, was more holes than fabric, held together by determination and the strategic placement of safety pins he'd found in Martha's old sewing basket. Anna's clothing situation was even more desperate, her tiny garments having been reduced to rags during their 4-day journey through the wilderness. Standing in his cabin, looking at 2 little girls wearing his spare shirts like oversized nightgowns, Jeremiah confronted the reality that good intentions wouldn't be enough to see them through a mountain winter. They needed warmth, protection, and dignity, things that required skills he hadn't used in 15 years. Martha's sewing basket sat in the storage chest like a relic from another life, its contents carefully preserved beneath tissue paper he'd never had the heart to disturb. Now lifting the lid with reverent fingers, he found himself face to face with the tools of domestic love, needles and thread, patches of fabric saved for future projects, and at the bottom, folded with characteristic care, the pieces of an unfinished quilt. The fabric squares told the story of their marriage in cotton and calico. Pieces cut from David's outgrown shirts, scraps from Martha's favorite dress, remnants from curtains that had hung in their kitchen window. She'd been working on it the week before the fire, planning to finish it as a Christmas gift for her sister's new baby. Now, holding those carefully cut patches in his weathered hands, Jeremiah saw not the ghosts of his past, but the building blocks of his present. "We're going to make you some proper clothes," he announced to Katie, who was attempting to keep Anna from investigating the contents of his ammunition box. Katie looked up with the skeptical expression of someone who had learned not to count on adult promises. "Do you know how to sew?" "Martha tried to teach me," Jeremiah admitted. "I wasn't much of a student then, but I'm motivated to learn now." What followed were several days of domestic comedy that would have made Martha laugh until tears streamed down her cheeks. Jeremiah's first attempt at threading a needle took 20 minutes and produced language that would have scandalized the church ladies. His initial efforts at cutting fabric resulted in pieces that bore only theoretical resemblance to human anatomy. And his first attempts at actual sewing created garments that looked more like abstract art than functional clothing. But Katie proved to be an invaluable teacher, possessing the kind of intuitive understanding of domestic tasks that came from watching her mother work. "The thread goes through the hole," she would explain patiently when Jeremiah struggled with basic techniques. "Then you pull it tight, but not too tight, or it breaks." Anna's contribution to the sewing project was less instructive but infinitely more entertaining. She had appointed herself as supervisor of the thread, tangling it with scientific precision and providing helpful commentary that consisted mainly of gibberish and delighted laughter. Gradually, through persistence and Katie's patient instruction, recognizable clothing began to emerge from Martha's fabric scraps. A simple dress for Katie, fashioned from the blue calico that had been destined for the unfinished quilt. A tiny coat for Anna, pieced together from wool remnants and lined with flannel soft enough for sensitive skin. The stitching was far from perfect. Jeremiah's fingers were better suited to rifle maintenance than delicate needlework. But the clothes were warm, functional, and made with the kind of attention that spoke of genuine care. The first time Katie wore her new dress, she stood in front of the mirror, hanging beside Jeremiah's shaving stand, and smoothed the fabric with reverent fingers. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and Jeremiah felt something crack open in his chest at the wonder in her voice, but it was Anna's reaction that undid him completely. The little girl had taken her first confident steps across the cabin that morning, emboldened by her recovery and the security of warm clothing. When she reached Jeremiah, instead of the usual shy smile she'd been offering, she lifted her arms in the universal gesture of a child who wanted to be held. Up. "Papa," she said clearly, and the word hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. Papa. Not Mr. Not Sir, but Papa, the name David had called him. The identity he'd thought had died in the flames of his old life. He lifted Anna into his arms, feeling the solid weight of her healthy body against his chest. And for the first time in 15 years, the name didn't bring pain. It brought possibility. The nights had begun to carry a different quality as well, filled not with the hollow silence that had defined his solitude, but with the soft sounds of a family settling into sleep. Katie and Anna shared the makeshift bed near the fireplace, but often one or both would wake during the night, Anna from dreams that made her cry for her mama, Katie from nightmares about being lost in the snow. On those nights, Jeremiah would leave his bed in the loft and sit in his chair beside the fire, keeping watch over their sleep and offering comfort when the darkness brought fear. He'd learned that Anna could be soothed by soft humming, something he'd forgotten he knew how to do, and that Katie responded to quiet conversation about safe topics like the animals they might see when spring came or the stories behind the scars on his hands. "Were you scared when you were little?" Katie asked one night after a particularly vivid nightmare had left her shaking and tearful. "Sometimes," Jeremiah admitted, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "Everyone gets scared sometimes. It's what you do with the scared feeling that matters. What did you do?" "I learned that being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. It means taking care of the people you love, even when you are afraid." Katie considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "Are you taking care of us because you love us?" The question hung in the air between them, honest and direct in the way that only children could manage. Jeremiah felt the truth of it settle into his bones before he could think to guard against it. "Yes," he said quietly. "I am." "Good," Katie said, settling back into her blankets with the satisfaction of someone who had received the answer she needed. "Anna and me love you too, Papa Jerry." Papa Jerry. The name wrapped around his heart like one of Martha's quilts, warm and protective and completely unexpected. As he sat in the firelight, listening to the peaceful breathing of two little girls who had chosen to trust him with their lives, Jeremiah Wolfe began to believe that sometimes the most important journeys didn't take you away from home. They brought you back to a home you never knew you were searching for. The first real test of Jeremiah's newfound domestic responsibilities came with the realization that feeding two growing children required more than his usual diet of bacon, beans, and whatever game he could hunt. Katie had begun asking pointed questions about vegetables. Anna had developed strong opinions about the texture of her food, and both girls deserved better nutrition than his bachelor existence had provided. Martha's recipe book emerged from the storage chest like a message from his past, its pages yellowed with age and spotted with the evidence of years of faithful use. Her handwriting filled the margins with notes about technique and ingredient substitutions. Add extra molasses if the children are helping. Double the butter for special occasions. Papa Jeremiah likes his biscuits with honey. Reading her words felt like having a conversation across the years, her voice guiding him through the mysteries of proper meal preparation. The book fell open naturally to a page titled Nourishing Soup for Winter Days, and Jeremiah studied the recipe with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. The ingredient list seemed manageable: root vegetables, dried beans, salt pork, and herbs. But the technique described in Martha's careful script revealed layers of complexity he'd never considered during his years of simple survival cooking. "We need to make a trip to town," he announced to Katie, who was helping Anna stack blocks made from carved wood scraps. "Both of you need proper food, and I need supplies I can't get from the mountain." Katie looked up with an expression that mixed excitement with concern. "Will there be other children in town?" "Probably," Jeremiah said, then noticed the way her face tightened. "Does that worry you?" "Anna doesn't talk much yet," Katie explained, unconsciously moving closer to her sister. Sometimes grown-ups think we're strange because we've been alone so much. The protective instinct in her voice reminded Jeremiah that these children had survived more than just their parents' death. They'd navigated a world where being orphaned made them objects of either pity or suspicion. His own reputation in Cedar Ridge hadn't exactly prepared the way for a warm welcome. "We'll manage," he said with more confidence than he felt. "Besides, it's time people knew you belong with me." The journey down the mountain took most of a morning, with Jeremiah carrying Anna when the trail became too difficult for her short legs, and Katie walking beside them with the determined stride of someone accustomed to long distances. The wagon Jeremiah had hidden in a shed near the base of the trail was still functional, though it protested every mile with squeaks and rattles that spoke of long neglect. Cedar Ridge looked much the same as it had during Jeremiah's previous supply runs, a collection of wooden buildings arranged around a main street that served the mining camps and isolated homesteads scattered throughout the territory. But arriving with 2 children changed everything about the experience. Where before he'd been able to conduct his business in anonymous efficiency, now he found himself the center of curious attention. "Well, I'll be," said Henry Morrison, the general store owner, as Jeremiah entered with Katie holding one hand and Anna balanced on his hip. "Jeremiah Wolfe, as I live and breathe. And who might these young ladies be?" "This is Katie and Anna," Jeremiah said, conscious of the way conversation in the store had quieted as other customers turned to stare. "They're staying with me." Henry's weathered face creased with curiosity, but his tone remained respectful. "Fine-looking children. What can I help you folks with today?" Jeremiah consulted Martha's recipe book, reading from the careful list he'd prepared. "I need root vegetables, carrots, potatoes, onions, dried beans, molasses, proper flour for baking, and fabric for winter clothes." "That's quite a list," Henry observed, beginning to gather the requested items. "Planning to do some serious cooking, are you?" "Learning to," Jeremiah admitted, watching as Katie examined a display of penny candy with barely concealed longing. "These girls deserve better than my usual bachelor fare." The conversation might have continued in that vein, polite but probing, if not for the arrival of Mrs. Victoria Pemberton, Cedar Ridge's self-appointed guardian of community morals. She swept into the store with the authority of someone accustomed to having her opinions taken seriously, her sharp eyes immediately fixing on the unusual sight of Jeremiah Wolfe with 2 small children. "Mr. Wolfe," she said in a tone that managed to convey both surprise and disapproval. "I wasn't expecting to see you in town, especially not with companions." "Mrs. Pemberton," Jeremiah replied evenly, shifting Anna to his other hip and feeling Katie move closer to his leg. "These children," Mrs. Pemberton continued, studying Katie and Anna with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating livestock. "They don't look familiar. Where exactly did they come from?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire, carrying implications that made Jeremiah's jaw tighten. He could see the calculation in Mrs. Pemberton's eyes. A hermit mountain man, appearing with 2 young children. No explanations offered, no official documentation presented. Their parents died, Jeremiah said simply. "They needed help. I provided it." "How?" "Charitable of you," Mrs. Pemberton replied, though her tone suggested she found nothing charitable in the arrangement. "But surely you understand that proper care for orphaned children requires more than good intentions. There are procedures, official channels, institutions designed specifically for such situations." Katie's hand tightened on Jeremiah's pants leg, and he felt Anna's arms squeeze around his neck. Both girls had grown very still, the way small animals did when predators circled nearby. "The girls are doing fine where they are," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying a warning that Mrs. Pemberton was either too determined or too oblivious to heed. "Are they, though?" she pressed. "A man living alone in the mountains, no female influence, no proper schooling or social interaction with other children. It's hardly an appropriate environment for proper development." The criticism stung because it contained just enough truth to be dangerous. Jeremiah knew his mountain cabin wasn't the ideal place to raise children. He knew his experience with child-rearing was 15 years out of date and had ended in tragedy. He knew that Mrs. Pemberton's concerns, however uncharitably expressed, came from a place of genuine worry for Katie and Anna's welfare, but he also knew something Mrs. Pemberton couldn't see. The way Anna's fever had broken in his arms, the way Katie's nightmares had gradually faded as she learned to trust that someone would keep watch over her sleep, the way both girls had begun to laugh and play and behave like children instead of survivors. "They're my responsibility now," he said firmly, "and they'll stay my responsibility." Mrs. Pemberton's expression suggested she had opinions about that arrangement. But before she could voice them, an unexpected ally emerged from the back of the store. Victoria Pemberton. "You leave that man alone," came the sharp voice of Doc Harrison, Cedar Ridge's physician and one of the few people in town who remembered Jeremiah from before his hermit days. "If Jeremiah Wolfe says he's caring for those children, then they're being cared for properly." The doctor emerged from behind a display of patent medicines, his medical bag in one hand and his other hand extended toward Anna. "Hello there, little one," he said gently. "You look healthy as a spring colt." Anna, who had been shy with Mrs. Pemberton, surprised everyone by reaching toward the doctor with a bright smile. Doc Harrison chuckled as he accepted her offered hand, his experienced fingers automatically checking her pulse and observing her color and demeanor. Strong heartbeat, clear eyes, good muscle tone, he pronounced. "Someone's been taking excellent care of you, hasn't he?" The professional assessment carried more weight than any argument Jeremiah could have made. Mrs. Pemberton's expression shifted from accusatory to merely skeptical, though she clearly wasn't ready to abandon her concerns entirely. "Perhaps," she said, with the air of someone conceding a minor point while reserving the right to revisit the larger issue. "But the question of legal guardianship remains. These children need proper documentation, official standing. What happens if something occurs to Mr. Wolfe? Who speaks for them then?" It was a fair question, one that had been keeping Jeremiah awake during the long nights when he sat watching over the girls' sleep. He'd been so focused on the immediate challenges of keeping them alive and healthy that he'd avoided thinking about the legal complexities of their situation. "I'll look into it," he said finally. "But for now, they stay with me." Mrs. Pemberton nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had planted seeds of doubt she expected to flourish. "See that you do, Mr. Wolfe. The welfare of children is everyone's responsibility." As she swept from the store with characteristic drama, Doc Harrison shook his head and turned to Jeremiah with a sympathetic expression. "Don't let Victoria get under your skin," he advised. "She means well, but she's got a talent for making simple situations complicated." "Maybe she's right, though," Jeremiah said quietly, conscious of Katie listening to every word. "Maybe I'm not the best person to be raising children." "Nonsense," Doc Harrison replied firmly. "I've seen a lot of children in my years practicing medicine, and I can tell you this: love matters more than perfect circumstances. These girls are clearly thriving under your care." The doctor's words provided some comfort. But as Jeremiah completed his shopping and prepared for the journey back up the mountain, Mrs. Pemberton's questions echoed in his mind. Legal guardianship, official documentation. What would happen if something occurred to him? For the first time since Katie and Anna had knocked on his door, Jeremiah found himself confronting the possibility that loving them might not be enough to keep them safe. From a world that demanded paperwork and official approval for the simple act of caring for children who needed care, the ride home was quieter than the journey down, both girls sensing his preoccupation. But as they climbed back toward the cabin that had become their sanctuary, Katie's small voice broke the silence. "Papa Jerry, are we in trouble?" "No, sweetheart," Jeremiah replied, though he wasn't entirely certain of the truth. "We're not in trouble. We're just learning how to be a family, and sometimes that's more complicated than it should be." "I like being a family," Katie said simply, "even if it's complicated." "So do I," Jeremiah admitted, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in 15 years. 3 weeks after the uncomfortable encounter in Morrison's store, Sheriff Tom Coleman made the climb up Jeremiah's mountain trail with the measured pace of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. His arrival coincided with the kind of perfect autumn morning that made the high country look like something from a storybook. Golden aspen leaves catching the early light, mountain peaks sharp against a sky so blue it seemed painted. Jeremiah saw him coming from a quarter-mile away and had time to prepare both himself and the children for what he suspected would be an official inquiry into their living arrangements. Katie and Anna were playing in a patch of sunshine near the cabin, Anna stacking pine cones while Katie wove grass into elaborate patterns she claimed were boats. "Sheriff," Jeremiah said as Coleman dismounted from his horse, keeping his voice neutral despite the tension coiling in his chest. "Jeremiah." Coleman removed his hat and ran weathered fingers through graying hair. "Beautiful morning, it is. Coffee's fresh if you're interested." Wouldn't say no to that. The ritual of hospitality provided a buffer against whatever official business had brought the sheriff up the mountain. As Jeremiah poured coffee into tin cups, he was acutely aware of Katie's watchful eyes and the way Anna had moved closer to her sister, sensing the adult tension without understanding its source. "I suppose you know why I'm here," Coleman said after taking an appreciative sip of the strong brew. "Mrs. Pemberton's concerns, I'd guess. Among others, word gets around when a hermit suddenly turns family man." Coleman's tone carried no judgment, just the weariness of someone accustomed to mediating community disputes. "People are curious about the situation." "The situation is simple enough," Jeremiah replied. 2 orphaned children needed help. I provided it. Simple for you, maybe, not so simple for those who worry about proper procedures and legal considerations. Coleman set down his cup and pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "I've got some questions I need to ask, official-like. For the record." The questions came with bureaucratic precision. The children's full names, their ages, the circumstances of their parents' deaths, how they'd come to be at Jeremiah's cabin. Each answer was recorded in Coleman's careful script, creating an official record of what had been, until now, simply a matter of human decency responding to desperate need. "The thing is, Jeremiah," Coleman said when the formal questioning was complete, "there are procedures for handling orphaned children. Foster care, adoption processes, oversight to ensure their welfare." "Their welfare is fine," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying an edge that made Katie look up from her grass weaving. "I can see that. Anyone with eyes can see these girls are thriving." Coleman glanced toward the children, his expression softening slightly. "But the law doesn't always care what common sense can see. Mrs. Pemberton's filed a formal complaint, questioning your fitness as a guardian." The words hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. "On what grounds?" "Your isolation, mostly. No female influence in their lives, no formal education, no social interaction with other children. And then there's your history." "My history." Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Your military service came up in the record search. What you did in the war." The Civil War service that Jeremiah had spent decades trying to forget suddenly felt like it was happening in the present moment. The weight of his hidden military medal seemed to burn against his chest, where it lay concealed. Beneath his shirt, a reminder of honors he'd never wanted and actions he'd never been able to justify, even to himself. "I was a soldier," Jeremiah said carefully. "I followed orders and tried to keep my men alive. Not sure what that has to do with raising children." "You were awarded the Medal of Honor," Coleman continued, consulting his notes, "for actions at Gettysburg that saved your entire company but resulted in significant enemy casualties. The citation mentions extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming odds and tactical brilliance that turned certain defeat into decisive victory." Jeremiah's hands tightened around his coffee cup. The memories he'd spent 15 years suppressing threatened to surface. The sound of artillery, the smell of gunpowder and blood, the weight of decisions that determined who lived and who died. He'd been 22 years old, a sergeant with a company of boys, barely old enough to shave, facing Confederate forces that outnumbered them 3-1. What he'd done that day had saved 43 Union soldiers and earned him recognition he'd never wanted. It had also resulted in the deaths of over 100 Confederate boys who'd been no different from his own men, scared, young, far from home, fighting for causes they barely understood. "I never asked for any medal," Jeremiah said quietly. "Maybe not. But the fact remains, you're not just some mountain hermit. You're a decorated war hero with tactical training and proven leadership capabilities." Coleman folded his notes and leaned back in his chair. "That cuts both ways in this situation." "Meaning?" "Meaning some folks think your military background makes you uniquely qualified to protect and provide for these children. Others worry that someone with your training might be too comfortable with violence, too isolated from normal society to raise girls properly." The irony wasn't lost on Jeremiah. The same skills that had made him an effective soldier, the ability to make life-or-death decisions under pressure, to remain calm in crisis, to protect those under his care, were now being questioned as potential disqualifications for fatherhood. "What do you think, Sheriff?" Jeremiah asked. Coleman was quiet for a long moment, watching Katie help Anna arrange her pinecone collection into neat rows. "I think those girls have been through more trauma in their short lives than most adults see in a lifetime. I think they've found safety and love with you that they might not find in some official institution. And I think Mrs. Pemberton, for all her good intentions, has never had to make the kinds of choices you've made. But the law requires oversight when it comes to child welfare. There'll need to be periodic visits, documentation of their health and education, evidence that they're developing normally." Coleman stood and settled his hat back on his head. "I'm required to recommend they be placed in official foster care pending proper adoption procedures. And if I refuse to let them go, then we'll have a problem that'll require more than conversation to resolve." The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but clearly understood. Katie had stopped her grass weaving and was watching the two men with the sharp attention of someone who'd learned to read adult faces for signs of danger. "How much time do I have?" Jeremiah asked. "Mrs. Pemberton wants immediate action, but I've convinced her to allow for a formal evaluation period. 2 weeks for you to demonstrate that you can provide everything these girls need for proper development. After that." Coleman shrugged apologetically. After the sheriff left, Jeremiah sat on his porch steps with Anna on his lap and Katie pressed against his side, watching the golden autumn light fade toward evening. The peaceful mountain setting that had been his refuge for 15 years suddenly felt fragile, threatened by forces he couldn't fight with rifle or trapline. "Are we going to have to leave, Papa Jerry?" Katie asked with the directness that never failed to surprise him. "Not if I can help it," Jeremiah replied, though he wasn't sure how he could prevent it. "Good," Katie said with the absolute confidence of childhood. "This is where we belong." As night settled over the mountains, Jeremiah held his daughters close and tried to figure out how to prove to a skeptical world that love and commitment mattered more than official procedures and paperwork. The medal, hidden in his desk drawer, had honored him for saving the lives of soldiers under impossible circumstances. Now he needed to find a way to save the lives of 2 little girls, whose only crime was needing someone to care about them more than rules and regulations. The discovery came on a quiet Sunday morning, when Jeremiah was helping Katie sort through the few possessions she and Anna had carried during their 4-day journey through the wilderness. Most of their belongings had been lost or damaged beyond repair, but Katie had clung to a small cloth bundle throughout their ordeal, protecting it even when she'd been forced to abandon heavier items. "These were Mama's special things," she explained as she carefully unwrapped the faded fabric. "She made me promise to keep them safe, no matter what happened." Inside the bundle were the precious remnants of a life cut short. A few coins, a pressed flower that had once been yellow but had faded to brown, A letter written in a child's careful script that began, "Dear Mama, I hope you like my drawing," and at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of silk, a tarnished silver locket. Jeremiah's hands trembled as he lifted the locket, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. The silver was blackened with age, and the chain had broken in several places, but the delicate engraving on the front was unmistakable. A pattern of roses and vines that he'd traced with his finger countless times during the early years of his marriage. "May I?" he asked Katie, his voice hoarse with emotion he couldn't quite name. She nodded solemnly, understanding that this was a moment requiring reverence and care. The locket opened with the soft click Jeremiah remembered from decades past, revealing the small photograph inside. The face that looked back at him was younger, unmarked by hardship, but unmistakably familiar. The same dark eyes, the same gentle smile, the same way of tilting her head slightly to the left when posing for photographs. "Katie," he whispered, "what was your mama's full name before she married your papa?" "Emily Rose Whitfield," Katie replied promptly. "Mama always said her family name was important to remember, even though she didn't talk about her family much." Whitfield. Martha's maiden name had been Whitfield. Martha Rose Whitfield, who had spoken occasionally of a younger sister who'd run away from home after a family argument that had never been properly resolved. A sister she'd lost touch with, worried about, grieved for in quiet moments when she thought Jeremiah wasn't watching. "Katie," Jeremiah said carefully, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "Your mama, Emily, did she ever mention having a sister?" Katie's face brightened with memory. "Oh, yes. Mama talked about Aunt Martha sometimes, especially when she was sad. She said Aunt Martha was the best sister in the world, but they'd had a big fight about something when Mama was young, and she was too proud to apologize." The locket slipped from Jeremiah's suddenly nerveless fingers, landing on the table with a soft metallic sound that seemed to echo through the cabin like a bell. Katie and Anna were his nieces, Martha's sister's children. The family connection he'd never known existed, the blood tie that transformed their relationship from charity into kinship. "Mama always wondered what happened to Aunt Martha," Katie continued, unaware of the seismic shift occurring in Jeremiah's understanding of the world. "She said maybe someday when Anna was older, we could try to find her. Mama thought Aunt Martha might have children of her own by now." "She did," Jeremiah whispered. "She had a son named David." "Really? We have a cousin." Katie's excitement was infectious, and Anna began clapping her hands in response to her sister's joy, though she couldn't possibly understand the conversation. "Had," Jeremiah corrected gently. "David died when he was 8 years old. In a fire that also took your Aunt Martha." Katie's face fell as she processed this information. "That's so sad. Mama would have cried if she knew. She always said family was the most important thing in the world, even when they made you angry." The pieces of the puzzle continued to fall into place as Jeremiah questioned Katie about her mother's stories and memories. Emily had run away from home at 16, after a bitter argument with her parents about her choice of husband, a traveling preacher named Frank Mitchell, who'd been considered unsuitable by the respectable Whitfield family. Martha had taken her parents' side in the dispute, something she'd regretted for the rest of her life. Emily had moved west with Frank, bearing 2 daughters in mining camps and frontier towns, always moving, always searching for the prosperity and stability that seemed to remain just out of reach. She'd kept the locket as her only connection to the sister she'd lost to pride and stubborn words. "Mama used to hold the locket when she missed Aunt Martha," Katie said, fingering the tarnished silver with reverent care. "She'd tell me and Anna stories about when she and Aunt Martha were little girls, how they used to play dress-up and have tea parties with their dolls. The image of Martha as a little girl, playing with the sister she'd lost to family discord, hit Jeremiah with unexpected force. He'd known his wife as a fully formed adult, confident and capable, the center of their small family's universe. The idea that she'd once been a child herself, with a younger sister to protect and love and occasionally fight with, opened new dimensions of understanding about the woman he'd married. Mama always said she was going to write Aunt Martha a letter, Katie continued. She was going to apologize for the fight and ask if they could be sisters again. But then she and Papa got sick, and there wasn't time. The cruel irony of the situation settled over Jeremiah like a weight he could barely carry. Emily had died, still hoping to reconcile with the sister who'd already been gone for 15 years. Martha had died, still grieving for the sister she'd lost to pride and anger. And now their children, Emily's daughters and Martha's husband, had found each other through tragedy and desperate need, creating the family reunion that pride had prevented in life. Katie, Jeremiah said slowly, his voice thick with emotion, I think your mama and I need to have a talk with some people in town. About family, and about making sure you and Anna are taken care of properly. Are we really your family now? Katie asked with the directness that never failed to surprise him. Not just people you're helping, but real family. You always were, Jeremiah replied, lifting Anna into his arms and pulling Katie close against his side. I just didn't know it until today. The locket lay open on the table between them. Martha's young face smiling out from the tarnished silver, as if blessing the reunion that death and chance had finally made possible. The photograph had been taken before marriage, and motherhood had changed her. But her eyes held the same warmth and kindness that had made her the heart of every community gathering. The same love that had extended even to the sister she'd lost, but never stopped missing. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep by the fire, Jeremiah sat at his table with pen and paper, struggling to find words for a letter he should have written 15 years earlier. Not to Martha, words between them needed no letter, but to the authorities who questioned his fitness to raise Emily's daughters. The locket sat open beside his writing materials, its tarnished surface catching the firelight like a star. Inside, Martha's young face seemed to watch over his writing, encouraging him to find the words that would keep her sister's children safe in the family they'd discovered by accident and claimed by love. Tomorrow, he would ride to town with documentation of his relationship to Katie and Anna, legal standing that would trump Mrs. Pemberton's concerns and Sheriff Coleman's bureaucratic requirements. Tonight, he sat in the warmth of his cabin, listening to the peaceful breathing of his nieces, and marveled at the way love could travel through time and tragedy to create families in the most unexpected places. The mountain wind sang through the pine trees outside his windows, carrying the promise of winter, but no longer the threat of loneliness. Family had found him again, dressed in the clothes of strangers, but carrying the bloodline that connected him to Martha and the life he'd thought was lost forever. God, it seemed, had a sense of both justice and irony, delivering redemption in the form of two little girls who carried his wife's blood and his wife's capacity for transforming a house into a home. The formal custody hearing was scheduled for the first Monday in November, exactly 2 weeks after Sheriff Coleman's visit and 1 week after Jeremiah's world-changing discovery of the family connection that transformed charity into kinship. The interim period had been a whirlwind of legal preparation, community politics, and emotional preparation for a battle that would determine whether love and blood ties could triumph over bureaucratic skepticism. Jeremiah's first stop after the locket revelation had been the county courthouse, where he'd presented his marriage certificate to Martha Rose Whitfield and requested copies of all available records pertaining to the Whitfield family. The clerk, a nervous young man who clearly recognized Jeremiah's reputation but had never seen him conduct official business, had been surprisingly helpful in locating birth records and family documentation that established the connection between Martha and Emily. The paperwork told the story of a family fractured by pride and circumstance. Emily Rose Whitfield, born 1847, youngest daughter of James and Catherine Whitfield of Cedar Ridge. Martha Rose Whitfield, born 1843, married to Jeremiah Wolfe in 1869. The records also revealed that Emily had indeed married Frank Mitchell in Denver in 1878, against her parents' wishes and without her family's blessing. Most importantly for the custody case, the documentation established Jeremiah's legal standing as the children's uncle by marriage, giving him blood-related rights that superseded the concerns of social workers and community busybodies. But even with legal advantage, the hearing would require more than paperwork to succeed. Doc Harrison had agreed to testify about the children's health and development under Jeremiah's care. His medical evaluation of both girls had been thorough and overwhelmingly positive. Katie showed no signs of malnutrition or abuse, while Anna had not only recovered completely from her near-fatal fever, but was developing at a rate that exceeded normal expectations for a child her age. These children are thriving. Doc Harrison had written in his official report, "They show clear evidence of emotional security, proper nutrition, appropriate intellectual stimulation, and the kind of deep attachment that comes from consistent loving care. In my professional opinion, removing them from their current environment would constitute a significant trauma with potential long-term psychological and consequences." Henry Morrison from the general store had also volunteered to speak on Jeremiah's behalf, providing testimony about the dramatic changes in both the man and the children during their brief public appearances. "I've known Jeremiah Wolfe for 20 years, Morrison planned to tell the judge. "I watched him retreat from the world after his family died, and I watched those little girls bring him back to life. If that's not a miracle worth protecting, I don't know what is. But the most crucial testimony would come from Katie herself. At 4 years old, she was young to participate in legal proceedings, but her intelligence and maturity had impressed even Mrs. Pemberton during their previous encounters. Sheriff Coleman had interviewed her privately and come away convinced that her testimony could sway the judge's decision. "She's remarkable," Coleman had told Jeremiah after spending an hour talking with Katie about her life before and after arriving at the mountain cabin. "Old soul in a young body, with a clear understanding of what's happened to her and what she wants for her future. If she can speak that clearly in front of the judge, it'll be hard to argue against her wishes." The preparation period had also revealed the extent of community division over the custody case. Mrs. Pemberton had rallied a faction of concerned citizens who genuinely believed that institutional care would serve the children's best interests. They worried about Jeremiah's isolation, his lack of experience with child rearing, and the absence of female influence in the girl's development. "It's not personal," Mrs. Elizabeth Crawford, the town's former schoolteacher, had explained to anyone who would listen. "Mr. Wolfe seems like a decent man and clearly cares for those children. But caring isn't enough. They need proper education, social interaction, preparation for adult life. How can one man, living alone in the mountains, provide everything 2 growing girls require?" The opposition to Jeremiah's guardianship wasn't rooted in malice, but in genuine concern for child welfare. These were people who had seen too many children suffer from well-intentioned but inadequate care, who understood that love without resources and support systems often led to tragedy. On the other side, a surprising coalition of supporters had emerged from the community's quieter corners. Families who remembered Jeremiah and Martha from before the fire spoke about the kind of father he'd been to David, the patience and wisdom he'd shown in raising a son who'd been the pride of their small community. War veterans who knew about his military service respected both his character and his capability under pressure. "Jeremiah Wolfe saved my life at Gettysburg," testified Samuel Hutchins, an aging former corporal who'd served under Jeremiah's command. "He got 43 boys home to their families when everyone else thought we were dead men. If he could do that for soldiers, he can damn sure take care of 2 little girls who love him." The legal documents that would determine the children's fate lay spread across Jeremiah's kitchen table like battle plans. each form and affidavit representing a different aspect of the case he needed to prove. Guardianship papers, medical records, character references, financial statements, demonstrating his ability to provide for the girl's needs, the law required, documentation of every aspect of human love and commitment. But it was another document that occupied Jeremiah's thoughts during the long nights before the hearing, a letter he'd found among Martha's possessions, written but never sent, addressed to my dearest sister Emily in Martha's careful script. The letter, dated just 3 months before the fire that killed her, revealed Martha's deep regret about the family estrangement and her desperate desire to reconnect with the sister she'd lost to pride and stubborn words. "I think about you every day," Martha had written. "Wonder if you're happy, if you're safe, if you have children of your own now. I was wrong to take Papa and Mama's side in that awful argument. You were following your heart, and I should have supported you instead of judging you. If you ever receive this letter, please know that you are forgiven for everything and nothing, because there was never anything to forgive. Come home, Emily. Come home so we can be sisters again." The letter had never been sent, probably because Martha had died before finding the courage to mail it. But now it served as evidence of the family bonds that connected the Whitfield sisters across time and death. Bonds that extended to their children and the man who had loved them both in different ways. The night before the hearing, Jeremiah sat on his porch with Katie and Anna, watching the first snow of winter dust, the pine trees with crystalline beauty. The girls were unusually quiet, sensing the importance of tomorrow's proceedings without fully understanding the mechanisms that would determine their future. "Papa Jerry," Katie said softly, "what happens if the judge says we can't stay with you?" The question he'd been dreading hit him with the force of a physical blow. Throughout all the legal preparation and community politics, he tried to maintain confidence about the outcome, projecting strength and certainty for the girl's benefit. But the truth was that family connection and community support might not be enough to overcome institutional bias toward formal adoption procedures. "Then we'll figure out another way to stay together," he said, hoping his voice conveyed more confidence than he felt. "Family doesn't let go of family, no matter what some judge might say." Anna, who had been quietly arranging pine cones in patterns only she understood, looked up at him with the kind of trust that could break a heart. "Papa, stay," she said clearly, her vocabulary limited but her meaning unmistakable. "Papa, stay," Jeremiah agreed, lifting her into his arms and pulling Katie close against his side. "No matter what happens tomorrow, we're family now. Real family. And family finds a way to stay together." But as he carried the girls inside for what might be their last night in the cabin that had become their home, Jeremiah found himself praying to the God he'd abandoned 15 years earlier, not for divine intervention or miraculous outcomes, but for the wisdom to accept whatever decision the judge handed down and the strength to fight for his daughter's future, regardless of what form that future might take. The custody papers lay waiting on the kitchen table, official documents that would either confirm what his heart already knew or force him to find new ways to protect the family that love and providence had given him. Tomorrow, in a courthouse filled with strangers, he would argue for the right to raise Martha's sister's children as his own. Tonight, he would hold them close and listen to their breathing in the darkness, storing up memories against whatever tomorrow might bring. The courthouse in Cedar Ridge had never seemed so imposing as it did on the morning of November 7th, its weathered brick facade looming against a gray sky that threatened the season's first serious snowfall. Jeremiah arrived early with Katie and Anna, both girls dressed in the best clothes his limited sewing skills could provide, simple, but clean garments that spoke of care and attention, even if they lacked professional tailoring. Judge Harrison Blackwood presided over the territorial court with a reputation for fairness tempered by adherence to legal procedure. A man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He had seen every variety of human drama play out in his courtroom over 3 decades of service. Child custody cases were among the most difficult decisions he faced. requiring him to balance legal requirements against human need in situations where both sides usually had valid concerns. The courtroom filled quickly with interested parties and curious observers, the kind of community attendance that occurred when local issues touched on fundamental questions about family, responsibility, and the proper care of children. Mrs. Pemberton sat in the front row with her supporters, their expressions conveying sincere concern for the children's welfare. Behind them, Jeremiah's advocates filled several rows: Doc Harrison, Henry Morrison, Samuel Hutchins, and others who had stepped forward to defend a man they believed deserved the chance to raise his family in peace. The court calls the matter of guardianship for Catherine Rose Mitchell and Anna Mae Mitchell, Judge Blackwood announced, his voice carrying the authority of law and custom. Mr. Jeremiah Wolfe petitioning for permanent guardianship, with Mrs. Victoria Pemberton representing community concerns regarding the children's welfare. Mrs. Pemberton rose first, her presentation methodical and professionally delivered. She outlined her concerns about Jeremiah's isolation, the absence of female influence in the girls' lives, the lack of formal education opportunities, and what she characterized as the inherent instability of their current living situation. Your Honor, she concluded, while we acknowledge Mr. Wolfe's good intentions and apparent affection for these children, we must consider their long-term needs. They deserve the benefits of proper schooling, social interaction with peers, and the kind of comprehensive care that only established institutions can provide. Her arguments were reasonable, articulated with genuine concern, and supported by established precedent regarding child welfare. But when she finished speaking, the courtroom remained quiet, as if everyone present understood that reasonable arguments didn't always align with human truth. Judge Blackwood called Doc Harrison as the first witness, and the elderly physician's testimony carried the weight of medical authority combined with decades of community respect. He described the children's condition when they first arrived at Jeremiah's cabin, their remarkable recovery under his care, and their current state of health that exceeded normal expectations for children their age. In my professional opinion, Doc Harrison stated clearly, these children have received care that equals or surpasses anything they might receive in institutional settings. They show no signs of neglect, abuse, or developmental delays. If anything, they appear to be thriving in ways that suggest their emotional and psychological needs are being met exceptionally well. Henry Morrison followed, describing the transformation he'd witnessed in both Jeremiah and the children during their visits to town. His testimony painted a picture of a family unit that functioned effectively despite unconventional circumstances. Children who were polite, intelligent, and obviously secure in their attachment to their guardian. Samuel Hutchins' military testimony provided insight into Jeremiah's character under pressure, his leadership capabilities, and his track record of protecting those under his care. A man who saved 43 lives at Gettysburg has the kind of courage and judgment these children need, he told the judge with absolute conviction. But it was when Judge Blackwood called Katie Mitchell to testify that the courtroom's atmosphere shifted from legal proceedings to something more fundamental, a child's right to speak about her own future. Katie approached the witness stand with the composed dignity that had impressed everyone who met her, her small hand steady on the Bible as she took the oath to tell the truth. Judge Blackwood's voice softened as he questioned her, recognizing that this testimony might prove crucial to his decision. Katie, can you tell me about your life before you came to live with Mr. Wolfe? Mama and Papa were sick, Katie replied clearly. The fever came and they couldn't get better. Anna was getting sick too, and I was scared we were all going to die. That must have been very frightening. Can you tell me what happened next? I carried Anna through the snow for lots of days. She was so heavy, and I got tired, but I knew we had to find help. Katie's voice remained steady, despite the difficulty of recounting their ordeal. When we found Papa Jerry's house, I thought maybe he would help us not die. And has he helped you? Yes, sir. He made Anna better when she was burning up with fever. He made us clothes and taught me to cook and reads us stories by the fire. He takes care of us like papas are supposed to do." Judge Blackwood leaned forward slightly. "Katie, do you understand what this hearing is about? Some people think maybe we should live somewhere else instead of with Papa Jerry," Katie said, with the matter-of-fact tone she used for explaining obvious truths. "What do you think about that?" Katie was quiet for a long moment, her young face serious as she considered her answer. "I think families should stay together," she said finally. "Papa Jerry is our family now. Anna calls him Papa, and he loves us like papas love their little girls. If we went somewhere else, our family would be broken. And families aren't supposed to be broken if they don't have to be." The simple wisdom of her words settled over the courtroom like a benediction, cutting through legal complexities to reach the fundamental truth that even a 4-year-old could recognize. Love created family, and family deserved protection. Judge Blackwood called for a brief recess after Katie's testimony, and the courtroom emptied into the hallway with the subdued murmur of people who had witnessed something profound. Jeremiah knelt beside Katie, checking to make sure the formal proceedings hadn't overwhelmed her, but found her characteristically composed and alert. "Did I say the right things, Papa Jerry?" she asked with the concern of someone who understood the importance of her words. "You told the truth," Jeremiah replied, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "That's all anyone can ask for." When court resumed, Judge Blackwood called Jeremiah himself to testify, and the mountain man approached the witness stand with the measured stride of someone accustomed to facing difficult situations with quiet courage. The oath he swore on the family Bible felt like a sacred promise, not just to the court, but to Martha's memory and the children's future. "Mr. Wolfe," Judge Blackwood began, "you've heard Mrs. Pemberton's concerns about your fitness as guardian for these children. How do you respond to questions about their education, their social development, their exposure to female influence?" Jeremiah had prepared for these questions during the long nights before the hearing, but standing in the witness box with Katie and Anna watching from the front row, his prepared answers seemed less important than speaking from his heart. "Your Honor, I won't pretend I'm the perfect choice to raise 2 little girls. I'm an old soldier living alone on a mountain, with more experience burying the dead than nurturing the living. But these children didn't come to my door looking for perfection. They came looking for someone who wouldn't let them die." He paused, gathering his thoughts as he looked at the faces in the courtroom, some sympathetic, others skeptical, all waiting to hear whether love could triumph over procedure. "As for education, Katie's already learning to read using books that belonged to my late wife. She helps me with cooking and household tasks that teach practical skills most children never learn. Anna's learning to walk and talk in an environment where every word she speaks is celebrated like a miracle." Judge Blackwood nodded, making notes. "And the concern about female influence? My wife Martha was these children's aunt, their mother's older sister. Everything I'm teaching them about kindness, about treating others with respect, about the strength that comes from family, those lessons come from Martha's memory and influence. She may be gone, but her spirit guides every decision I make about their care." The revelation of the family connection had been documented in the court papers, but hearing Jeremiah speak about it in personal terms added emotional weight to the legal facts. These weren't just orphans he'd taken in from charity, they were his family, connected by blood and love across the years of separation and loss. "Mr. Wolfe, what can you offer these children that an established institution cannot?" Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands steady on the witness stand rail as he considered his answer. "I can offer them the same thing Martha and I offered our son David: unconditional love, consistent presence, and the absolute certainty that someone in this world cares more about their happiness than anything else." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "Institutions can provide education, social programs, proper procedures, but they can't provide what Katie and Anna need most: the security of belonging somewhere, of being wanted not because it's someone's job, but because they're family." Mrs. Pemberton had the right to cross-examine, and her questions were pointed but respectful. focusing on practical concerns about the children's future prospects and development opportunities. Jeremiah answered honestly, acknowledging the limitations of mountain life while emphasizing the compensating benefits of individual attention, family stability, and emotional security. When the testimony concluded, Judge Blackwood announced that he would deliver his decision immediately, rather than taking the case under advisement. The courtroom fell silent as he reviewed his notes, the weight of two children's futures hanging in the balance between law and love. This case presents the court with a fundamental question about the nature of family and the best interests of children. Judge Blackwood began, his voice carrying the gravity of judicial authority. We have heard compelling arguments from both sides, each rooted in genuine concern for Catherine and Anna Mitchell's welfare. He looked directly at Katie and Anna, who sat quietly in the front row with the patience of children who had learned to wait for adults to decide their fate. However, the court must consider not just theoretical best interests, but the actual circumstances before us. These children have a blood relative who has demonstrated exceptional care and commitment. They have shown remarkable recovery and development under his guardianship. Most importantly, they have clearly expressed their own preferences about their future. Judge Blackwood lifted his gavel, the wooden artifact that would seal their destiny with a single decisive motion. The court finds that Mr. Jeremiah Wolfe has demonstrated fitness for guardianship and that the children's best interests are served by remaining in his care. Guardianship is hereby granted with the requirement of periodic welfare visits to ensure continued, appropriate care. The gavel struck the bench with finality, and the courtroom erupted in applause from Jeremiah's supporters, while Mrs. Pemberton's faction maintained dignified silence. Katie's face lit up with joy as she understood that they would go home to their mountain cabin as a legally recognized family, while Anna clapped her hands simply because others were celebrating. Jeremiah felt his knees weaken with relief as the reality of victory settled over him. They had won not just a legal battle, but the right to remain together as the family they had chosen to become. The judge's gavel had spoken with the voice of law, but it had ruled in favor of love. 1 year later, on a crisp autumn morning that painted the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Jeremiah Wolfe stood on his front porch with a steaming cup of coffee and watched his daughters play in the clearing that had become their shared world. The silence that had once been his closest companion had been replaced by something infinitely more precious. The sound of children's laughter echoing through pine trees. The music of a family at peace with itself and the world. Katie, now 5 and reading with the fluency that amazed everyone who met her, was teaching Anna the fine art of leaf collection, explaining with scientific seriousness the differences between oak and maple, while her 2-year-old sister listened with the intense concentration she brought to all of Katie's lessons. Anna had grown into a sturdy, confident toddler, whose vocabulary expanded daily and whose fearless exploration of their mountain world kept Jeremiah constantly vigilant. The cabin itself bore witness to the transformation, that love could work on both people and places. Where once there had been the spare efficiency of a bachelor's existence, now there were signs of family life in every corner. Children's drawings pinned to the walls, toys scattered near the fireplace, a rocking chair Jeremiah had built for story time, and everywhere the accumulated evidence of daily life shared among people who belonged together. The storage chest that had once held painful memories now served as a repository for new treasures. Anna's first attempts at drawing, Katie's collection of pressed flowers, letters from well-wishers in town, and at the bottom, carefully preserved, the silver locket that had revealed the family connection that changed everything. Martha's photograph still smiled from within the tarnished silver, but now it seemed less like a memorial to the past than a blessing on the present. On the mantelpiece, beside the Winchester rifle that still held its place of honor, sat a new addition, a formal photograph taken at Morrison's store by a traveling photographer who had passed through Cedar Ridge the previous spring. The image captured Jeremiah seated in a chair with Anna on his lap and Katie standing beside them, her hand resting on his shoulder. All three wore their best clothes and serious expressions that couldn't quite hide their joy. It was, by any measure, the portrait of a family. The town's attitude toward Jeremiah and the girls had evolved considerably since the custody hearing. Where once there had been curiosity and skepticism, now there was acceptance and even admiration for the way the mountain hermit had transformed into a devoted father. Mrs. Pemberton herself had graciously acknowledged her error in judgment, and her periodic welfare visits had become friendly social calls, during which she marveled at the children's development and praised Jeremiah's dedication. "I was wrong," she had admitted during her most recent visit. "I thought love without proper infrastructure would be insufficient. But I failed to understand that love creates its own infrastructure, builds what it needs to succeed." The educational concerns that had dominated the custody hearing had been addressed through a combination of Martha's books, lessons from Doc Harrison during their town visits, and Katie's own voracious curiosity about the world around her. She could read better than most children twice her age, write with careful precision, and solve mathematical problems using pine cones and stones as teaching tools. Anna, meanwhile, was developing the kind of confidence and security that came from knowing she was cherished exactly as she was. Their weekly trips to Cedar Ridge had become social occasions that the entire town anticipated. Katie would demonstrate her reading progress to Henry Morrison, while Anna charmed customers with her expanding vocabulary and fearless personality. Doc Harrison had appointed himself their unofficial grandfather, providing medical care, educational guidance, and the kind of unconditional approval that all children need. But it was during the quiet evening hours, when the day's adventures had ended and the girls were settled for sleep by the fireplace, that Jeremiah felt most clearly the miracle of what they had built together. Story time had become a sacred ritual, with Katie choosing books from Martha's collection, while Anna snuggled against Jeremiah's side, thumb in mouth, listening to tales of adventure and heroism with sleepy attention. "Tell us about when you and Mama Martha were young," Katie would sometimes request. And Jeremiah had learned to share memories that honored his first family while celebrating his second. "Your Aunt Martha was the kindest person I ever knew," he would say, smoothing Anna's hair as she drifted toward sleep. "She would have loved you girls more than anything in the world. She would have made you cookies and taught you to sew and sung you lullabies just like your Mama Emily did." These conversations had become a bridge between past and present, a way of honoring the dead while embracing the living, of teaching the girls that love didn't end with death, but continued across generations in new forms and unexpected places. On this particular autumn morning, as Jeremiah watched his daughters explore their world with the confidence of children who knew they were safe and loved, he felt Martha's presence more clearly than he had since her death. Not as a ghost or a memory, but as a blessing that had taken 15 years to reach him, delivered through the love of her sister's children who had needed exactly what he could give. The sound of laughter drew his attention back to the present, where Anna had discovered a particularly interesting pine cone and was showing it to Katie with the enthusiasm of someone who had found treasure. Katie examined it with the seriousness she brought to all of Anna's discoveries, praising its size and perfect symmetry with the authority of someone who understood that encouragement was one of love's most important gifts. As he watched them, Jeremiah understood that healing came in many forms, that redemption could arrive wearing the faces of strangers, and that sometimes the most important journeys didn't take you away from home, but brought you back to a home you never knew you were searching for. The mountains stretched endlessly around their small cabin, magnificent and eternal but no longer lonely. Love had filled the silence, transformed isolation into sanctuary, and created from loss and loneliness something that would endure long after the snows melted and the seasons turned. They were family now, bound not just by law or blood, but by the daily choice to belong to each other, to build something beautiful from the ashes of what they had lost. And in the warmth of that belonging, surrounded by the peace of mountains and the promise of tomorrow, Jeremiah Wolfe finally understood that sometimes the greatest rescue comes not from saving someone else, but from allowing yourself to be saved by the very people who need you most.